Picture a single computing campus drawing 5 gigawatts of power.
Which is just a massive amount of energy.
Right. I mean, to put that into perspective, that is the equivalent energy output of 5 nuclear reactors, and that is just to run algorithms.
Yeah, just doing the math.
Exactly. When you hear people talk about the AI revolution, it usually sounds like, magic. We talk about neural networks, large language models, algorithms that can generate art out of thin air. It all sounds so weightless.
It really does. It creates this illusion that artificial intelligence is just like floating somewhere up in the ether, completely disconnected from physical reality.
Yeah, but the cloud is not weightless at all. It is incredibly heavy, it runs at scorching temperatures, and the physical infrastructure required to keep it alive is, well, it's currently demanding the most staggering amounts of capital in human history.
Oh, absolutely.
So today, for you, the listener who actually wants to know how the physical world works behind the screen, we are going completely under the hood.
Because we really are right in the middle of a massive hardware arms race right now. And understanding the plumbing is the only way to understand who will actually control the future of computing.
Right. So today's deep dive pulls from a wild mix of sources to show you exactly how this is happening. We are tracing a path from the quarterly financials of a Swedish semiconductor company called Sivers to a quiet manufacturing partnership all the way up to a breaking news leak out of Mark Zuckerberg's infrastructure empire that is currently shaking up the entire stock market.
Yeah.
We're looking at a piece from Tom's Hardware on that front.
And it might seem like a really disparate pile of information at first glance. I mean, a niche tech earnings report and a piece of big tech gossip, but they are deeply, inextricably linked by the laws of physics and economics.
They really are. Our mission today is to connect those dots for you. We are going to trace the line from microscopic silicon lasers all the way up to multi-billion-dollar data center wars. So, okay, let's unpack this, starting at the absolute microscopic level.
Which is actually where the entire AI industry is currently bottlenecked.
Right.
Before you can understand what the tech giants are doing, you really have to understand the tiny physical hardware making their ambitions possible. Because right now, the biggest speed limit on AI isn't just processing power. It's not just about, designing a smarter chip.
No, it's the traffic jam between the chips.
Exactly.
I was looking through the Sivers Semiconductors interim report for the first quarter of 2026, and I kept seeing this phrase, energy-efficient photonics. They describe themselves as a critical enabler of a greener data economy.
Yeah, that phrasing is super important.
Right, and to understand why that matters, I started picturing the current AI hardware situation. It feels like we were building a fleet of incredibly fast supercars. Those are the GPUs, right? The graphics processing units doing the heavy AI math.
Yep, the expensive ones.
Right. But we are trying to drive these multi-million-dollar supercars on a one-lane dirt road. Are Sivers photonics basically the multi-lane fiber optic superhighways needed to keep these GPUs fed with data?
That is the perfect way to look at it. The GPUs are the supercars, and the traditional copper wires connecting them inside the data centers are, well, they're those dirt roads. And what's fascinating here is the sheer physics of the problem.
How so?
Well, as AI data centers scale up to train these huge large language models, you have tens of thousands of GPUs that need to talk to each other almost instantly. If you push that much data through traditional copper wires, you just hit a physical wall.
Because of the heat, right?
Yes. The electrical resistance in the copper slows the data down, and worse, it generates an enormous amount of heat. You're essentially turning your data center into a giant toaster oven.
Which means you are forced to spend a fortune on air conditioning just to keep the cables from literally melting.
Exactly. It becomes this totally unsustainable loop of power consumption. So the only way to solve this massive supply-demand imbalance in networking is to stop using electricity to move data and start using light.
Wow.
That is what photonics is. You move the data using lasers. And Sivers is developing specialized lasers using a material called indium phosphide.
Indium phosphide? I mean, that sounds like something you'd use to power a starship.
It does sound sci-fi, right? But it is a very specific, highly complex semiconductor material. It's uniquely capable of creating high-performance lasers that don't degrade under extreme heat.
Oh, wow.
And this isn't just some lab experiment either. The sources show Sivers is collaborating with a massive global manufacturing company named Jabil to develop what they call a 1.6T pluggable optical transceiver module.
Okay, wait, let's break that down for a second. The 1.6T means it handles 1.6 terabits of data per second, which is insanely fast. But what does a pluggable optical transceiver actually do?
Think of a transceiver as the ultimate high-speed translator. A GPU speaks in electrical signals, but fiber optic cables speak in light.
Okay.
So the transceiver sits right in the middle. It takes the electrical data from the chip, converts it into microscopic laser pulses, fires them down the optical highway, and then translates the light back into electricity on the other side.
So they're literally building the on-ramps and off-ramps that allow these GPU supercars to actually use the fiber optic superhighway.
Exactly that.
And looking at this headline note, Sivers also just partnered with Global Foundries, who are, one of the biggest semiconductor manufacturers on the planet.
Yeah.
And this is specifically to develop silicon photonics for AI infrastructure.
Right, and getting a heavyweight like Global Foundries involved proves this technology has to be manufactured at a massive global scale.
Yeah, no kidding.
And it really highlights why Sivers calls this a greener data economy. Because if you replace heat-generating copper with highly efficient lasers, you strip out a massive amount of power consumption. You are literally saving the local power grid while allowing the AI to run faster.
Okay, so that solves the internal bottleneck. It gets the data moving at light speed inside the building. But that brings us to the second stage of our deep dive, which is the macro expansion.
Right, getting the data out.
Because once the AI processes all that data, it has to get out to the rest of the world somehow. And Sivers is placing a massive bet on how data travels outside the building, specifically through wireless and satellite communications.
The S8 comm sector.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, the demand for data isn't just on the ground anymore.
Right. And looking at their Q1 2026 financial report, there's a number that just jumps right off the page. Sivers' total opportunity pipeline, which is the potential future business they are tracking and negotiating it, grew by a massive 77% year to date.
That is a huge jump.
It really is. It reached $799 million, nearly $800 million bucks in potential demand.
Yeah, that kind of jump indicates an industry-wide panic to secure the underlying hardware.
But I actually have to push back here because there is a glaring financial contradiction in their own report.
Okay, let's hear it.
If their pipeline exploded by 77% to almost $800 million, why did their actual realized revenue for the quarter drop by 22%?
Yeah.
I mean, they only brought in 61.9 million Swedish krona, and their adjusted EBITDA was negative 13.8 million krona. Wait, if everyone supposedly wants their lasers and transceivers, why are they bleeding money and seeing revenue shrink?
It's a very astute observation, and it perfectly illustrates the brutal reality of hardware economics.
Okay.
First, let's look at that adjusted EBITDA number. That is a metric companies use to show their operating profitability. It strips out accounting factors like taxes and depreciation to show the raw cash flow of the main business.
Got it.
So the fact that it's negative means the core operations were running at a loss this quarter. But when you dig into the report, you see the revenue drop wasn't because customers walked away. It was driven by two external factors.
Which were?
First, foreign exchange headwinds. The Swedish krona was fluctuating badly against the dollar and the pound. But more importantly, there were massive delays in U.S. defense budget approvals.
So government red tape essentially holding up the checks.
It's exactly that. The report explicitly mentions that the U.S. government shutdown and defense budget delays in late 2025 pushed expected revenues deep into 2026.
Oh, wow.
Because hardware infrastructure is not software. You don't just, download a laser. It takes months to manufacture and ship, and when a government budget stalls, the entire supply chain freezes. But that $800 million pipeline tells you the underlying demand for these digital picks and shovels is skyrocketing.
And it's not just civilian tech companies buying them either. It's modernized warfare and the space economy. Like, the report notes that York Space signed a definitive agreement to acquire Sivers' strategic customer, a company called Allspace.
Yeah, and that detail is crucial for understanding where computing is headed. York Space is positioning itself as a prime player in the orbital industry.
Which is huge.
It is.
Yeah.
The space economy is projected to hit $1.8 trillion by 2035. And think about the physics again. You cannot lay a fiber optic cable in low Earth orbit.
Right, obviously not.
So if you want a constellation of satellites to share data instantly, you have to beam that data through the vacuum of space using highly efficient lasers. Sivers is providing the underlying communication hardware for that orbital infrastructure.
That makes total sense. And back on Earth, they're getting funded by the U.S. CHIPS Act for the EW STAR program, which is an electronic warfare defense initiative. Plus, they have a $1.5 million partnership with Tachyon Networks for fixed wireless access products.
Yep.
And the report specifically mentions 60 gigahertz and 28 gigahertz frequencies for those products. What makes those so special?
So those frequencies are essentially massive, wide-open lanes for data in the air. A 60 gigahertz band can carry an incredible amount of information, but the catch is that it requires direct, uninterrupted line of sight between the transmitter and receiver.
Okay, so it can't easily punch through walls.
Exactly. So you need highly specialized, heat-resistant hardware to manage those signals reliably, especially military applications where extreme environments are just the norm.
Okay, so whether it's an AI data center in a warehouse, a military jet in a war zone, or a satellite in orbit, the demand for the physical hardware to move data is just exploding.
It really is.
Which leads to the obvious question: who is actually writing the checks for these superhighways? Here's where it gets really interesting, because that brings us to the tech giants.
The hyperscalers, the companies with pockets deep enough to actually build the future.
Specifically, Meta. According to a breaking news article from Tom's Hardware, Meta's sheer scale of building is altering the gravitational pull of the entire tech landscape. We have to talk about their capital expenditure forecast for the full year of 2026.
The scale of this number is almost difficult to comprehend.
It is nuts. Meta raised its full-year capex forecast to between $125 billion and $145 billion. Mark Zuckerberg is planning to drop up to $145 billion in a single year entirely on physical infrastructure.
It is arguably the most aggressive corporate spending spree in history.
To put that in perspective, Zuckerberg cut 8,000 jobs specifically to help pay for this hardware. He laid off thousands of employees just to buy chips and build data centers. It's like realizing your house has terrible water pressure, but the city tells you the only way to get more water is to buy an entire second Hoover Dam. You have to buy massive, indivisible blocks of capacity, even if it means liquidating your other assets to do it.
That Hoover Dam analogy hits the nail on the head. Capacity at this scale cannot be built incrementally. You don't just buy a few more servers and run an extension cord out the back window.
Right.
You have to build out entire municipal power grids. The article details Meta's physical footprint, and it is staggering. They have a data center campus called Prometheus that is designed to scale up to 1 gigawatt of power. And another one, the Hyperion campus, is designed to scale up to 5 gigawatts.
5 gigawatts. Going back to our nuclear reactor comparison from earlier, the Hyperion campus alone is designed to consume the equivalent output of 5 nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
It's enough power to run a major metropolis, all dedicated to processing algorithms.
And this perfectly bridges the gap back to Sivers and their greener data photonics. When you are drawing 5 gigawatts of power, if your internal copper wiring is inefficient, you are wasting hundreds of millions of dollars just on the air conditioning required to stop the building from literally catching fire.
Just burning cash to keep it cool.
Exactly. You are absolutely desperate for anything like those indium phosphide lasers that makes the system run cooler. The micro-level physics directly dictate these macro-level infrastructure costs.
It also explains why Meta is signing these massive hardware treaties. Like, they signed a $100 billion agreement with AMD for 6 gigawatts of hardware. They signed a multi-billion-dollar deals for Graviton CPUs with Amazon just to cover their shortfalls. I mean, they are absorbing every piece of hardware they can find.
But because they are forced to build in these massive multi-gigawatt blocks to future-proof themselves, they've accidentally created a very strange economic distortion.
Which brings us to the final, wildest part of our deep dive: the cloud rebellion. Because Meta is building so much capacity so quickly, they've generated a massive surplus. According to the Tom's Hardware report, Meta is reportedly launching something called Meta Compute. They are planning to rent out their excess AI hardware capacity and their proprietary AI models, like their closed-weight Muse Spark model, to other developers.
Let's quickly define a closed-weight model for a second.
Oh, sure.
In AI, the weights are essentially the parameters and the secret sauce that make the AI smart. A closed-weight model means the underlying recipe is locked in a vault. Meta owns it, and if you want to use it, you have to pay Meta for access and run it on their terms.
Right, so by launching Meta Compute, they are monetizing both the hardware and the lockdown software.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean for the rest of the industry? To understand why this is an earthquake, you have to look at who Meta usually buys from. Historically, Meta has been a massive customer of companies called neoclouds. These are specialized companies whose entire business model is buying GPUs in bulk and renting the compute time to other businesses. Meta was so hungry for hardware that they had committed roughly $48 billion to these neoclouds $21 billion to a company called CoreWeave, and $27 billion to a company called Nebius.
Yeah, and Meta was paying these middlemen billions because even with $145 billion in capital, their own data center construction couldn't keep pace with their immediate internal needs. The neoclouds were essentially acting as a vital bridge.
But the moment the news leaked about Meta Compute, the moment Wall Street realized Meta was about to start renting out its own 5-gigawatt surplus, the market reacted violently.
It really did.
Meta stock jumped over 10% in a single day, but the neoclouds tanked. CoreWeave dropped 10.8%. Niveus fell 12.4%. So what does this all mean? Were neoclouds like CoreWeave basically just a temporary bridge for Meta until they finished building their own mega campuses? Is Meta just eating its own suppliers here?
The market instantly repriced the entire power dynamic. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a brutal truth about hyperscale economics. Companies like Meta are becoming the new landlords of the AI era
Wow.
because they have to build in 5-gigawatt increments. The very second a new campus like Hyperion comes online, they suddenly have vastly more computing power than they can actually use that day.
Right, they have all this extra space.
So instead of letting it sit idle, they flip the switch. They instantly transition from being the biggest cloud customer on Earth to being a dominant cloud provider themselves. If you're listening to this and wondering, wait, doesn't Amazon or Microsoft basically own the cloud? Well, you are exactly where the market was yesterday before this news broke.
Right.
Meta Compute puts Mark Zuckerberg in direct competition with Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud.
And it is an existential threat to the smaller neoclouds. Companies like CoreWeave built their massive valuations largely because Meta was their anchor tenant. Now, the anchor tenant just built a bigger building across the street and is trying to steal their other customers.
It's ruthless. And Meta isn't the only one realizing this trick, by the way. The article points out that Elon Musk's SpaceX did something remarkably similar.
Yes, with xAI's Colossus One supercomputer in Memphis.
Exactly.
Colossus One is a 300-megawatt facility. It's massive. And SpaceX just turned around and leased out its excess capacity to Anthropic for $1.25 billion a month. They also leased capacity to Google for $920 million a month. I mean, they're literally renting out their own infrastructure to their artificial intelligence rivals.
This raises an important question about the modern barrier to entry in tech. 10 years ago, the barrier to entry was having a great idea and a team of smart engineers in a garage.
Yeah.
Today, the barrier to entry for artificial intelligence is having the capital to build a 5-gigawatt power grid, securing $100 billion in hardware, and waiting for the U.S. government to clear the supply chain.
You literally have to operate with the budget and the physical footprint of a sovereign nation-state to even play the game.
And when you play the game at that geopolitical level, you inevitably overbuild to ensure you aren't caught short in the future, which means you inevitably end up becoming a utility provider for everyone else.
You build the Hoover Dam for your shower, and then you start selling electricity to the entire town.
Exactly.
It completely flips the power dynamic of the internet. And the underlying mechanism for all of this, the reason they need all this power, the reason they need the neoclouds, and the reason they are now destroying them all, traces back to the sheer physical volume of data that has to be moved without melting the servers.
Which brings us right back to the very beginning of our deep dive, to the microscopic plumbing, making the 5-gigawatt campuses possible in the first place.
Exactly. So let's quickly recap this incredible journey for you listening. We started at the absolute subatomic level, looking at Sivers semiconductors building indium phosphide lasers and optical transceivers to stop AI data centers from turning into ovens.
Right, and we saw how that niche hardware company is tracking an $800 million pipeline because the demand for moving data is extending into orbit, driven by the U.S. military and a looming $1.8 trillion space economy.
Then we zoomed out to look at the buyers, watching Meta plan to spend $145 billion in a single year to build data center campuses that draw as much power as a nuclear fleet.
And finally, we saw the economic fallout of that. Meta overbuilding so aggressively that they morphed from a $48 billion customer of cloud computing into a massive cloud landlord themselves, sending shockwaves through the stock market, just crushing their own suppliers.
It really is the most expensive infrastructure project in human history. The plumbing is microscopic, but the economics are planetary. And that leaves us with a lingering thought for you to chew on today as you look at your phone. If the cost of entry into the next generation of computing requires 5-gigawatt campuses and $100 billion hardware budgets, are we moving toward a future where only 3 or 4 companies on Earth literally own the physical infrastructure of human knowledge? And if artificial intelligence requires this much power, this much cooling, and this many lasers just to function today, wait, I mean, think about it, what happens to the physical world when it gets even smarter tomorrow?
That is the trillion-dollar question. And it's going to be answered in the physical world, not just the cloud.
It really is. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We know your time is incredibly valuable, and we love that you spend it staying insanely curious with us. Keep questioning the world behind the screen, look out for the physical engines running the invisible cloud, and we will catch you next time.